Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast, weekly news roundup edition. Thank you guys so much for joining us. If you are new to the channel, please hit like, please hit subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell as we are constantly adding new shows to the channel. If you are a patron, then you get to be part of the patron-only after hours, which typically on Thursday nights includes a call-in segment. We recently did the Mau Mau Hour with Pascal Robert yesterday and had maybe our best Mau Mau Hour call-in segment to date. It was a lot of fun. And next week we're doing movie night. So if you want to be a patron, it's as simple as going to patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. You get access to all of the after hours / champagne room sessions and more. Well, let me bring in our hosts, co-hosts, our news bringer tours. And the first one is my co-host, my homie, my dog. He is the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. I gotta tell you, Jason, for the audience who don't know, Jason was playing some of the most sumptuous jazz music before the show. I'm a big fan of John Coltrane. I'm not trying to pretend to be a jazz connoisseur, aficionado. I know what I like, and I like what I like. I love John Coltrane. He was playing some Coltrane, man. The brother put me in just the most relaxed, mellow mood.
Which incredible. I'm glad, because I was not in a good mood as I'm having camera problems. So yes. I was cursing up. They couldn't hear me. I was cursing up a storm. But the jazz is helping. Pascal's good mood is helping. Let's bring in another person that's in a good mood that helped me a little bit today with my final thought of the day. He is everyone's favorite middle manager of the largest battle station in 4-star systems. I think he also did the Kessel run in 10 parsecs. He is the Deep State Kuba.
Hello, everyone. I'm looking forward to this. Otherwise, my day has just been life coaching stormtroopers, and let me tell you, that starts depressing and ends worse.
Have you seen the trailer for the new Star Wars series, Obi-Wan Kenobi?
I have not. I watched the Book of Boba Fett, and Summer and I, the whole time, we were like, he's just making one crime lord mistake after another. This is really some Bush League bullshit. You could see the betrayals coming. Frankly, I don't think he's earned Mos Eisley. I don't think he's earned Mos Vespa, for that matter, right? Like, go back to Little League, learn to steal some bases.
I found this out recently because the show that I'm definitely trying to get on. Oh, can we give a shout out, a TIR shout out to another Haitian brother? Wrzesniewski Albright is in the chat.
Big what's me? What's the truth? What I saw? Big Wars in the house.
So the show that I really want to get on, I would love to get us all on it. I don't even care if we have to go to a studio and film it. Is In Search of Tomorrow, which is a documentary series. They're going to make multiple, because they made multiple of the horror series, In Search of Darkness. And there's a trailer out where they talk about Return of the Jedi. And apparently Lucas had originally wrote the Boba Fett character to have a huge role in Return of the Jedi. And it was going to be more movies. I think he planned it out to be about 4 or 5 more movies. But by the time he got done kind of writing the script, he was like, oh, fuck it. We're just going to end it with the redemption story of Anakin Skywalker. We're not going to go any deeper than that. So that's why Boba Fett's character, you see him in the beginning and you're like, oh, yeah. Because remember, you know how they pan to him in the beginning of Return of the Jedi, and you're like, yeah, yes. And then all of a sudden he has that kind of unceremonious ceremonious ending with the accidental. Like, how does the most badass bounty hunter in the galaxy get killed accidentally?
Yeah, I mean, the musicians on the barge should have been playing yakety sax for that.
So that's why it was a bigger role that was intended for Boba Fett, and Lucas said, fuck it, and they scrapped an entire storyline. So that was sad for Boba Fett, but he was supposed to get his redemption song in the Boba Fett series. I don't think he necessarily got it, but The Mandalorian is great. Great.
Everybody loves Pedro Pascal.
Yeah,
I like the original Star Wars prequels and sequels. Then they started making too many, man. I did like the Han Solo movie, though.
This is a good movie.
It was a good movie.
And it also illustrates that one of the problems with the Republic was that they never addressed the issues of inequalities in the Outer Rim. Like slavery. Big problem in the Outer Rim. Never addressed it.
I mean, I think it just came down to the inefficiency of their military contracting processes. The Empire really cleaned that up.
That's why I kind of, well, look, we can have a whole Star Wars show. There's actually some important things I want to get to. And since Wozniak's in the chat, I do want to send this invitation out. Big Woz, we do a sports show every other Monday. We would love to have you come in, talk some NBA with us. We're definitely going to be talking NFL trades and the NCAA tournament. Please feel free to come through and let's talk some sports. Let's talk some shit.
Big Woz is the sports guy.
He is a sports guy. I like a lot of what he has to say. So I would love to hear him come have this conversation with us about sports, about Deion Sanders trying to call out NFL teams that didn't come to the Black College Pro Day. And why might that be?
I heard
I would love
Deion
to hear his
Sanders
take.
got the Kunta Kinte treatment and they cut off some of his foot. Is that true? Like
He injured himself. He didn't try to escape.
But they cut off like some toes?
I know he injured his toe, but I don't know if they cut it off. He had a really bad toe injury.
Wow.
Really bad toe injury. Yeah, he was like on a chair and crutches for that season I saw with that team. I actually followed as much as I could. The Jackson State, I believe he's at.
Yeah, he's causing a serious historically Black college and university sports revival.
Kind of. But that's why, again, invitations out there. Big Woz. We can have a whole conversation about this. Why there were so many people from Black colleges that went in the NFL in the 60s and 70s, and why you see the huge fall off definitely in the 80s and 90s and even until now.
Oh, I know somebody who might be a good guest for that.
Wrzesniewski Albright?
Wrzesniewski Albright, but also my good friend who is a commissioner of one of the athletic leagues in the HBCU. Definitely knows that history well. I'll contact him and see if he'd be interested.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Because I have my thoughts and theories on it, and I will save that for Monday. So tune in Monday, same time, for Beyond the Red Zone, the sports show. But Pascal, you want to talk about something that you've kind of touched on before. The latest SCOTUS pick, Ketanji Brown Jackson, is going through the GOP gauntlet at her confirmation hearings. Some commentators on the left have questioned her progressive bona fides, calling her another Kamala Harris or Obama on the Supreme Court. You've called her maybe the most progressive pick you've seen since Thurgood Marshall. So why is there so much hate coming for her and it's part of what I'm seeing on the Black online left? And what is the Democratic Party doing wrong with this nomination?
You know, Jason, I really appreciate that question. It's a good question, and it really is a really important conundrum. I think that the Ketanji Brown Jackson nomination demonstrates a certain type of crisis going on, excuse me, in black politics relative to the Democratic Party. For those of you who don't know, I wrote a piece in the fall for Black Agenda Report called Are Black People the Crash Test Dummies for the Democratic Party? And in that piece, I pretty much laid out the history of how the bipartisan neoliberal or pro market economic pivot that happens after the civil rights movement basically forces a situation to happen where the Democratic Party, particularly with the rise of Clintonian Democratic Leadership Council neoliberalism, literally does more harm to black, brown, and poor and working class communities overall than Republicans in many ways, policy wise, not to romanticize the Republicans. What is happening right now, from my observations, is that in the post Obama era, in the face of the fact that 35% of black wealth basically evaporated with no recourse under Obama, and that Biden was the vice president of that administration, in wake of the fact that Biden was pretty much the most distasteful candidate in the eyes of many segments of the black community because of his long-standing, rather ambivalent, history on racial politics, going back to busing, and his literal role as an architect of the Omnibus Crime Act and the mass incarceration bills during the Clinton regime, that Biden had a very, very dubious, frankly, connection with black voters coming in. And I think it's safe to say, if it wasn't for the fact that Trump was seen as such a racially and politically noxious and vile figure, and was somewhat being painted as a kind of reemergence of fascism combined with the COVID phenomenon that was just beginning to hit, there's a good possibility that Trump could have won that election in November of 2020. And we all know what happens after that. So what I'm really trying to convey, and I'll bring this to Ketanji Brown Jackson, is that in certain segments of the black body politic in America, there is a crisis of legitimacy with the Democratic Party. I think that crisis of legitimacy is seen very much so with the under 40 demographic contingency. And I think it's also seen with some of the more working class elements in the black community who have not seen the best promise of the stimulus packages that was promised by Biden. People have not seen or benefited from extensions of the child tax credits. Some people are still wedded to concepts of affirmative action and things of reparations and things of that nature. And what it really is demonstrating is that this crisis of legitimacy, even though there has been this kind of rhetorical belief that Biden has been, the most progressive president since FDR, really in reaction to the COVID crisis, that his policy concessions in the face of the economic crisis of COVID are not resonating with black voters. Because if you look at his polling numbers since October 2021, he's actually in like the 60% zone or less in terms of favorability with black voters. In comparison, yes, of all other ethnic demographics, black voters support Biden higher than both Hispanics and whites. But in terms of, in comparison to other Democratic presidential administrations, Biden's support amongst black voters is pretty much lower than anything we've seen within the last maybe 3 Democratic presidential administrations. And the question becomes, what exactly can be done for Joe Biden to redeem the faith of Black constituents, even in regarding the fact that he has Kamala Harris, the first Black female vice president, who doesn't seem to be resonating much confidence in Black spaces either, even considering that he has a quote-unquote very racially diverse administration, even in the face of the fact that upon his acceptance speech after the winning the presidency, he gave a speech saying that Black folk had my back and I'll have theirs. Black folk did turn Georgia blue in 2020. In the face of all of that rhetorical flourish and belief that, Black folk were going to, rally the troops around Biden, that really hasn't been the case. I think that one of the main reasons, and there's a very good article in 538 blog, that there's a sentiment that Biden is really not rallying the troops, is that there are certain core issues that are of concern to Black constituents that many feel that Biden has been rather short to address. And one of the key issues is the voter suppression epidemic that's going on through southern states. And why hasn't Biden issued any kind of legislation, executive order, or positioned himself to suspend the filibuster to possibly pass some kind of voter protection bill, considering that the most loyal constituency to the Democratic Party have been Black American voters. And what we're finding in this article in 538 that I shared with Jason is that it basically admits that even though Black people by over 90% support the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party basically takes them for granted because they're viewed as a captured constituency. How does this relate to Ketanji Brown Jackson? The belief that Biden had was that in promising to nominate a Black woman, that symbolic politics would somehow be enough to rally the troops for Biden in Black constituencies. The Democratic Party understands that, and I would say, unfortunately, Black people are still somewhat motivated by this symbolic presence of Black faces in high places in political administrations. There are some people, I would argue, that they tend to be older. I would also argue that it's a class factor of Black professional managerial class Blacks who are still wedded to wanting to see themselves in large numbers in the presidential administration of the moment. And because Ketanji Brown Jackson is considered to also be progressive, it was assumed that she would be able to sway such support in Black spaces that it could actually have a translation in terms of the 2020 midterms to carry that over to 2022 midterms to November voting. I don't think it's accidental that it's right now that this resignation is happening and Ketanji Brown Jackson is being floated to replace, I believe it was I forget the name of the Supreme Court justice who's resigning. I think that was strategically orchestrated to rally the Black voter shock troops around the 2022 midterms. And the question becomes, is that going to work? And I don't think it's going to work because of the fact that Black voters are so absolutely cynical about Joe Biden. And because of the fact that he erroneously, in my humble opinion, touted this pick as a purely identity politics bone that he was throwing to Black voters, I think Black people of that certain age cohort under 40, and particularly working class Black people, are not buying the symbolism anymore. And you can see that I think that the burn that some black folk feel from the Obama presidency is turning into a kind of blowback against symbolic politics, where people are saying, if we had a first black president who couldn't do anything for us, why do we think these other black faces in high places are going to do anything for us? So I think that there's a developing fracture generationally, under 40, and class wise, working class blacks who just frankly are not feeling the traditional way in which the Democratic Party has used symbolic politics of representation to corral voters around their agendas during election time. And what I see happening is that a generation of black folk are alive to the duplicity of the Democratic Party in that regard, but it's denying them that cynicism is denying them the realization that Ketanji Brown Jackson is actually a fairly, more than fairly, significantly good Supreme Court nominee based on her bona fides on core issues that are particularly salient to black constituencies, criminal justice being one of them. So my position is that this is a bit of a political conundrum, not only for the Democratic Party, who I care less about, but particularly for black constituents, in that I think it's good that the containment structure of black politics being contained in the Democratic Party be fractured, but I don't necessarily think the terms of the realignment are clear in terms of how they're going to create a more effective coalition of black voters on a working class level to chart their own path. And that's what I gotta say.
So, one thing that you brought up was the class element, and thinking about the type of advice that Biden might be getting about how to engage with the black voters who might be delivering that advice. There's a well-known divide among white voters between the sort of PMC, woke, very identitarian, very into symbolic politics stratum that is overrepresented in the Democratic Party apparatus and in the activist community. Is there something similar in the black political class, that there's a bubble where above a certain level you just can't relate to the experience of regular voters?
That's a very, very good question. I think that analogy is very true, in that just by a cursory observation of the reaction to the Ketanji Brown Jackson nomination, you will find that black professional managerial class types, professionals, education, doctors, lawyers, engineers, service professionals, business, IT types, dual degree having black folk, are very energized about Ketanji Brown Jackson, are very energized about kind of rallying the troops around Biden of a certain age. And when I mean of a certain age, particularly over 40, you find that much less even among college educated under 40 black folk, who I would argue that the main dividing line is not simply about generational, it's about materiality. What do I mean by that? People over 40, particularly the closer you get to Generation X and late baby boomers, they can remember being beneficiaries of post-civil rights policies that lifted them up into the middle class, whether they be affirmative action, minority set-aside programs, higher educational opportunity programs, things of that nature, of a certain class of black people. So as a result, they can remember, well, hell, in the 90s, I was able to buy 2 houses and things were good. My 401k looked good under Clinton, because they weren't the one getting mass incarcerated. They weren't the one being called a welfare mama. They weren't the one who was getting sister soldier. Right?
Well, I would say that it wasn't programs as much as it was deregulation. There was more black people, non-college educated, that came up through deregulation. I'm talking about the total ending of Glass-Steagall, the ability to get high interest, no money down mortgages that really excelled many into the middle class, and even ones that were already in the middle class got into another level with the overnight gain in property values. So, I mean, we always have to keep that in mind, that more people came up during Bush, definitely, than Clinton, because Bush regime definitely doubles down on that deregulation.
Plus, low interest rates were a lot lower under Bush too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, also under Bush is when some of the smarter money saw the end of the real estate boom and began looking for suckers to keep it going.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you have direct targeting of minority communities, not just Black people, but also Latinos, recent immigrants, for the ninja loans and other types of subprime mortgages that then fuel the dramatic collapse in 2008. And they take a lot of other homeowners with them. And to be fair, I'm not blaming the recipients of the loans. I'm blaming the loans and the originators.
Well, there was a lot of fraud. There was a lot of
oh yeah, absolutely,
absolute fraud in terms of how these loans were marketed, sold, and things of that nature as well. I mean, there are many banks that were sued as a result of this. But I mean, the point, and I don't think we're in disagreement here, is that the under 40 generation that we're talking about, they were too young to experience any of those benefits from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and frankly came of age when all they got was Obama austerity, post-2008 crash, subprime mortgage crisis crash, downward mobility, and significant student loan debt. And they frankly are not as easily swayed by this symbolism. A larger portion of them even turned to Trump than older Black voters, if you look at the actual small percentage of those that did vote for Trump. So this crisis is real. I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, but what I'm saying is that unfortunately it is obscuring the capacity to rally the troops in support, particularly amongst that younger cohort, for a Supreme Court pick that on the actual qualifications does demonstrate some tangible benefits policy-wise for Black constituencies.
Well, what do you say to people, maybe we have to say this again, that say that she's bad on labor?
Well, of course, we know that there's one, I mean, out of this woman's whole 25, 30-year legal career, one case people are focusing on where she made a decision that was rendered to protect the interests of a certain constituency of Black class in the lawsuit class. I mean, in a class action lawsuit. Part of that class, if the decision had gone in favor of the Black workers in question, there are other Black workers who would have been denied or not acknowledgement of their capacity to participate. And she made a ruling that basically favoring one class over the other would have unjustifiably denied access to a larger constituency of workers. So I don't think that one class determines her as being anti-labor at all. There are other judgments she's made that are actually very much pro-labor. Is that she made a very nuanced, technical type of determination in one case, and now everyone's painting her as some kind of like anti-black labor judge, which is quite false. That's not the case at all. If you look at her overall record, the woman is legitimately rather progressive as a judge. As a matter of fact, and I said this yesterday, I think she might have trouble with many of the Republicans. If you look at the way they're painting her, they're making it seem like she's like Malcolm Farrakhan or something. Like this chick is like some kind of like, I think this chick, that's terrible. This woman is some kind of radical, like, revolutionary nationalist or something.
Ted Cruz brought out the Ibram X. Kendi anti-racist baby book.
He still didn't do a better job than me.
Oh, I mean, come on. You have that voice that's like smoothed over honey while he's Ted Cruz.
Watched for those that don't know, there is a clip. We have a playlist of clips where I think it was when we first started doing like an after hours kind of thing. I want to say it was, but was it maybe 2 years ago, going on 2 years? We did, my youngest son got Anti-Racist Baby as a Christmas present, and I decided to read it to Pascal, Kuba, and Djene. And at one point, Pascal is beatboxing while I'm reading it, and Kuba and Djene are just beside
looking uncomfortable and white.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting discourse that's coming up in the chat. It's kind of like, as leftists, we should be anti-Supreme Court. It's a bourgeois institution, blah, blah, blah. On a theoretical level, I understand that. The question becomes, are we going to be irrelevant ultra-leftists who are going to stand around pontificating about how, bourgeois electoralism doesn't mean anything, comrade, the bourgeois Supreme Court doesn't mean anything, comrade? Are we going to try to engage in a materialist politics that actually improves the conditions of people's lives?
I think you're going to pontificate and fart sniff. No, that's not the plan. Sorry.
I'm just saying, I think it's really kind of, you have a politics that basically has been out of favor with most Americans for over 50 years. Most Americans are afraid of certain phenomenons, losing the right to vote. Some of them are. The Supreme Court becoming too conservative. Who becomes the next president? And your response was like, well, Lenin said that bourgeois liberal democracy is a waste of time and they're always going to be collaborating with capital. So there's no reason for us to tell the pros to support this stuff. The revolution is about to come, comrade. Come now. That's stupid.
Well,
that's pseudo politics.
My Lenin had a great jam with his girlfriend and Chuck Berry. So.
Well, what do you she was replacing a Democratic pick.
Yeah.
Is this going to matter at all, given the majority, the secure majority that the Republican nominees enjoy on the Supreme Court?
I mean, in the immediate future, probably not. In the long term, possibly, depending on, we don't know who lives or dies in the long term. But also, I mean, someone was suggesting, we should advocate for Biden to expand the court. I think that's absurd, quite frankly. I mean, I'm just not. Why is it that Democrats and liberals believe that it's okay when they want to break the rules, but they cry when Republicans do it? Like, what kind of politics is that?
The politics of the virtuous loser, right? The politics of embracing your victimhood. It's one of the biggest complaints about the Democratic Party is that they act like they don't want to win, and they kind of seem like they don't want to win.
Well, Kuba, it's been a while, and people kind of no longer have Ukraine on the brain. I blame this on the hyper politicized nature of the way many of us consume media. But what has been the NATO G8 EU response to not just the current war in the Ukraine with Russia, but also the refugee crisis as well?
Well, on refugees, there's been more than 3 million Ukrainians that fled the country, 2 million through Poland, and the European Union. One of the stereotypes in the transatlantic relationship is that the US is daddy, the EU is mommy. That's where you go if you want your free healthcare. That's where you go if you want your social spending. And that, in this case, mommy stepped up, and Ukrainian refugees. And just to give a sense, the 2015 refugee crisis was a little over 1 million Middle Eastern refugees coming in. And it was a big adjustment and a difficult to absorb that full wave. Right now, in a much shorter time frame, it's been 3 times as large. I think that the crisis mentality and the fact that this is a neighboring country, and the picture of Putin as a villain helps motivate Europeans to look after incoming Ukrainians. And the types of complaints that were made about the 2015 wave are generally not applied to Ukrainian refugees. And part of that stems from difference in country of origin, complexion, religion, but also given the coverage of the invasion of Ukraine, there's almost universal sympathy for the suffering of Ukrainian people and admiration for their resistance to the Russian invasion. NATO has responded by pouring in as many weapons as it possibly can through Poland, through other NATO allies into the hands of the Ukrainians, because Russia has held back its air force from the operations in Ukraine. There's different theories about that, and I have my own. The ability to move supplies into Ukrainian hands is quite secure as long as Western Ukraine doesn't fall under threat. That's one reason why there have been some missile attacks against targets in Western Ukraine, primarily places that the Russians characterize as ammo dumps or distribution centers. But right now, the Ukrainians are not likely to run out of firepower anytime soon. Heavy weapons are a bigger problem. The plan to transfer MiG fighters from Poland, Bulgaria, Slovakia to the Ukrainian Air Force has run into American hesitancy because it would be seen as a potential escalation, and there is fear that there might be a Russian response that's unexpected and dramatic that would complicate the ability to contain the conflict. And this is really a big moment for all of the transatlantic institutions, NATO, the G8, G7, and the EU, as to what their future will be, how relevant they'll be as organizations, what the roles are to be divided up between them in the, what they like to refer to as the rule-based international order. And it's unclear to what extent the EU efforts are coordinated with NATO. Certainly, there was some embarrassment when the U.S. declined to greenlight the transfer of the MiG fighters. That came out without U.S. approval from the Polish side. And there might be parallel efforts that aren't entirely complementary. If a European defense and foreign policy gets established out of this, that might create more tensions between the NATO and the transatlantic institutions and ones that are based on the EU, especially now that the UK has exited and that Brexit is finished, severed its relationship with the EU under very acrimonious terms. And the UK has traditionally been America's greatest partisan inside the European Union and the greatest stumbling block, not coincidentally, to greater European integration and coordination, especially on defense and foreign policy. So those are the transatlantic institutions. The G8 is where many of the economic sanctions are being debated, because it also includes Japan as a major economy that is not a European or NATO power. And Zelensky addressed the Japanese diet remotely, using very strong terms to call on the strongest possible sanctions and the greatest possible support for Ukraine. And he he thanked Japan for its support in the conflict. The coordinating the sanctions has proven, on the one hand, everything has happened very quickly. On the other hand, the announcements seem to have been a little premature. Today, there were marathon meetings, NATO, G7, and EU in Brussels to discuss the response to Russia. And on the German side, there was an unwillingness to sever energy trade with Russia. It simply put, Europe is too dependent on Russian gas to be able to add that to the mix of sanctions and economic constraints without some way to offset it. And while Qatar and other suppliers of liquefied natural gas have said that they're going to increase their supplies to Europe, there isn't that much give in the system for that to be a seamless transition. The Qatari LNG is already spoken for. Generally speaking, energy is sold not at a spot rate, but on large volumes through large-scale contracts. So the Qataris would have to short another customer in order to substantially increase their contribution to the EU. This might create an opportunity for American fracking. That industry took a severe hit as energy prices fell. Now that Russian supply is constrained, potentially you'll get more Pennsylvania, more North Dakota, more Texas, Oklahoma industry involved in extracting gas to be sold to Europe. But there's also been developments on the Russian side. Somebody in the chat brought up the India-Russia trade in rubles as a potential complication for the sanctions order, and indeed it is. So Russia has taken a couple of steps to try to respond to U.S. sanctions. It's requiring that energy sales be conducted in rubles. Typically before, Europeans or other foreign countries would deliver dollars or euros to a Russian bank, which would handle the conversion and keep those reserves as part of its deposits. And ultimately, that's where a significant amount of Russian foreign currency reserves, that's how they were built up. But something like $300 billion worth of those reserves were impounded at the start of the conflict, which demonstrates not only the power of the sanctions, but also the risks of trading in dollars if there's any political sensitivity. So Russia now, they'll continue to sell you oil, but you have to get the rubles yourself, which creates an international market for rubles, helps shore up their currency, and means that Western banks that deal in and Western payment systems that deal in euros and American dollars don't control the transactions. You can't sanction transactions that are occurring in rubles on the SWIFT system because the SWIFT system doesn't accommodate that. This creates a challenge for the purchasers because there aren't that many rubles out there. And the one country that has a long-standing currency relationship with Russia is India. Russia-India trade has been conducted on a ruble to rupee basis for years now. And there's derivatives, there's institutions that are specialized in this. So India may end up being the channel for getting around sanctions to trade with Russia. And that relationship is unlikely to develop further out into, third country transactions. Egypt and Bulgaria aren't going to be using rubles for their trade. But as more countries from the global south look at their energy requirements and the types of commodities that they need to purchase from Russia, then you might have a deepening of financial relationships between countries in the global south and India in order to access those ruble to rupee lines without going through Western controlled currencies like the US dollar or the euro.
Kuba, I want to ask you a question on this. I've been observing the reaction since the commencement of the Ukraine invasion, and I've seen the sanctions, and there was a lot of, I don't know, propaganda. There was a lot of rhetoric in the media. And it seems that the Russians have played very effective strategic chess in terms of how they would work around these sanctions. And it's surprising some people in the West how many foreign countries, quite frankly, are willing to play ball with Russia in the wake of this media barrage that's painting Putin as a combination of Hitler, Mussolini, and everything else. And in that reality, right, we understand that the Saudis have given Biden the cold shoulder. The petromonarchies have given Biden the cold shoulder.
Israel.
We understand that Israel is not participating in sanctions on Russia, which tells me quite a bit. We understand that India, as you mentioned, China. We understand that even Mexico was vacillating in terms of how to deal. Brazil is saying that they're not turning their back on the Russian. Do you think that this move, which really is orchestrated by the Biden administration in the West to try to bury Russia, may backfire and actually lead to the multipolarity that has been bandied about by the Western Bloc?
So multipolarity has been the Russian and Chinese goal for restructuring the international system away from the kind of transatlantic bloc leading the show, and the United States being first. I was going to say first among equals, but no, it's just the leader of the Western powers. And I think that what we're seeing, a little like what we're seeing in Ukraine militarily, is a remarkable display of ingenuity and backbone under extremely difficult conditions. But that's not to say they're winning. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the sanctions have failed or that Russia is building up, has diffused the bomb. It's more that the experience that Russia had with the sanctions that have already been imposed after the seizure of the Crimea, its experience in dealing with countries like Syria and Iran, and the need to go around trade restrictions in order to make deals with countries that the West wants to treat as pariahs, that it has adapted some strategies knowing that there would be very serious economic restrictions. And the result is a little like the COVID response. Rather than having a catastrophic depression, there's a survivable recession in Russia. And there are very strong incentives whenever you sanction a major exporting country like Russia, especially one which has a commanding market share in certain important commodities. There's an incredible opportunity for whoever the middleman turns out to be. If you're willing to break sanctions and serve as the depot country for basically laundering Russian exports, then that gives you the opportunity to rack up some super profits just on the arbitrage between what Russia needs to sell at and what buyers are willing to pay, especially under shortage conditions created by the sanctions. And if India can play that role, then it's good for Russia, because otherwise China would have a monopsony on Russian exports. And certain key strategic goods, and we're not just talking about energy either, but chemical fertilizers, precursor chemicals for silicon computer chips and other IT technology. There are deep-pocketed buyers who need those in order to maintain their operations, and they'll be more than willing to accept any kind of legal fig leaf that India could provide in order to continue accessing those exports from Russia. And I think that there's, when it comes to the response of the global South, the West, and especially the United States, does itself a real disservice by accepting its own narrative uncritically and assuming that that's the universal perspective. And you can definitely find leaders, countries, journalists, other figures in the global South that are scandalized by the Russian invasion and that will line up with the West. But there's a diversity of opinion among countries that have been on the receiving end of local aggression, that have been on the giving end of local aggression, that have fallen afoul of the Western rules-based order, that are much more hesitant to uncritically accept the moralized narrative about what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And ultimately, if you're a small country without a great deal of resources that isn't heavily integrated into one bloc or another, regardless of what you consider to be the right and wrong of the conflict, you need to do what's in your best geopolitical interests. And this is true for Israel, this is true for the UAE, this is true for India. You can't rely on being a charter member of the transatlantic bloc. You can't rely, and you also don't want to slip into Belarus-style Russian peonage. So you have to find the way to, I think Dusty called it dancing at both weddings.
I did like that analogy. Sounds like a smart foreigner. Like they'd say, like, how do you say that in Polish, Kuba?
Treason. Yeah, I mean,
Pascal, can you say dancing at both weddings in Haitian Creole?
Danser à deux mariages.
See, that sounds like when you're having the political meeting, and you just say that. That's how you know. Dun dun dun. Well, in closing, Madeline Albright, former Secretary of State, passed away recently at the age of 84. While there have been several obits and retrospectives of her life and service, Albright as feminist icon, she's yet another architect of the war on terror to pass away in the last 5 months. Colin Powell died in October of last year. The passing of Albright got me thinking about how we'll view her time in political power in this hyper-political moment that we're still currently in. Post-World War II, the U.S. started to double down on amorphous wars: poverty, drugs, and terror. These wars seem to be endless. There is no end goal, just a comic book narrative of good versus evil that is easy to spin and even easier for the masses to consume. When we think about things like residential schools, Japanese internment, These are things that have left a scar of shame on the American body politic that have led leaders to seek recompense for the crimes. What will be the compensation for what the war on terror has done to our loss of civil liberties? What will be the compensation for what the war on terror has done to our loss of the mass incarceration of Muslims during the early years of the war on terror? Minority Report is not the future. It is the past. It is now. There is a preemptive fight against the fear of a manufactured other. If the war on drugs during the Nixon administration was a war on poor blacks and white leftists, what three-letter agencies did it birth? What does victory look like 50 plus years later? And what was it even supposed to look like? The war on terror has birthed some very powerful agencies with expanded power and a gutting of judicial review. Immigration lawyers look at policies like special registration as a new Japanese internment. I asked a good friend who spent 15 years in immigration law about this moment in time, and this is what she replied with. This is part of her reply. I will be posting the entire 5-page reply in Patreon. Post 9/11, one of the most significant changes to immigration laws was a massive expansion of executive power that gutted judicial review and permanently altered significant portions of the legal landscape of this country. Mere weeks after 9/11, the Bush administration authorized spying on Americans, a new, completely confidential and unregulated military tribunal system, and systematic organized detentions of Muslim men. Of course, the policies enacted did not explicitly say that they were targeting Muslims, but the language was transparent enough and the enforcement blatant enough that the intention behind the policies was crystal clear. Conveniently labeled special registration, the policy of quite literally rounding up Muslim men in the aftermath of 9/11 attack was pitched to the American public as an innocuous but necessary safeguard against future terrorist insurgencies on American soil, thereby once again conflating national security with immigration policy. Historically, immigration laws and programs have served as tools to oversee, eliminate, or curtail the activities of people who may pose a threat to national security, which begs the question, have we forgotten the tenets of inclusion upon which this country was allegedly built? Federally mandated programs like the Alien Absconder Initiative 1, as well as the voluntary interviews of non-citizen men, were enacted, resulting in the interrogation and, more often than not, apprehension of immigrants from predominantly Muslim countries. Remember, the Committee on Military Affairs did not call H.R. 6758 the Japanese internment bill, and it was touted as an evacuation of Japanese Americans initially. These voluntary interviews were labeled special registration by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, and fairly transparently sought to round up non-citizens who were in both valid and invalid immigration status to determine, based on spurious and shockingly vague standards, if those people had any ties to terrorist organizations. Again, if you want to read the entire 5-page response to one question I had about the war on terror, I will be posting that shortly in Patreon. The language of amorphous wars isn't lost on the left/progressive wing of capital as well. The war on racism or anti-racism, social justice, wokeism warriors seem to be fighting endless battles that have some lucrative dividends. Tamika Mallory, who helped organize the Women's March after the election of Trump, took that woke rhetoric to the bank, became part of the pro-BLM ad campaigns we saw during the summer protests of 2020. Are six-figure diversity and inclusion positions making racism go away? Is it really designed to? If inexorable racism is the root cause of economic precarity, then how can we ever hope to live in a world without Black and brown suffering? We'll answer that question and so much more in the bonus patron half of the show called the Champagne Room. Are you guys ready to get out of here?
Yeah, man.
I could go for some champagne.
On behalf of Pascal Robert and Deep State Kuba, We hope to see many of you guys in the champagne room, where we will continue this conversation talking about the new SCOTUS pick, the EU's response, and Pascal's love for Madeline Albright.
Fuck out of here.
Power is an aphrodisiac.
That's Kissinger who said that.
And we are out.